You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos Reyes and Christopher Zender. Today we discuss literature, especially in the light of beauty and form. And it's been said that truth and beauty, well, beauty and truth, beauty is the truth at play. And so we're going to explore that possibility as well. Now, our welcome guest is James Matthew Wilson. He is Professor of Humanities and the founding director of the Master of Fine Arts program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Among his many books are The Vision of the Soul, Truth, Beauty, and Goodness in the Western Tradition. And here is my copy of it right here. But his most recent work, The Strangeness of the Good from Angelico Press in 2020. Let's first begin with a prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in this consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Professor
Wilson, could you first tell us a bit about your background and your family?
I had that question well in advance, and I thought, where to begin with that? I don't know, but I guess I'll begin not at the beginning, but where it's most appropriate. I'm since just before we started recording, we were talking about Jacques Maritain. I suppose it's appropriate to say I'm from a old Notre Dame family. a family of Hoosiers who were attending Notre Dame when it was still a school for boys. That is to say, before it was a full-fledged university. And I think that spirit of Notre Dame in several respects has informed a lot of things about my family and about my life. By that, I don't specifically mean football, although I could. There's a couple of pictures of the Golden Dome behind me. This is my father's office I'm speaking to you from. But I studied for my doctorate at Notre Dame, and I came at a fortunate time because I was studying literature, but I was able to work with the great poet and philosophical theologian Kevin Hart while he was at Notre Dame, and then also with the great Thomist Ralph McInerney. I was, I suppose, de facto one of his last doctoral students. And I think of those two as having informed my way of thinking about things. And but in a way analogous to the way Jacques Maritain himself has informed how I think about things. That is to say, when I entered into advanced studies, what most excited me about the intellectual life was the ability to move as Maritain, the philosopher, moved among the disciplines, and to trust that as long as you have a good concept of being and a good concept of intellect, you're going to be able to make discoveries in whatever field of inquiry you enter into and to gain in wisdom. So I studied literature there, and then I at Notre Dame, and then I went to Villanova University, where I joined the Department of Humanities and Augustinian Traditions. And that was a department inspired by the Christian personalism of John Paul II. And we sought to renew liberal arts education across the disciplines by reintegrating the disciplines. So it was one of the joys of my life to spend 12 years building up that program. And it enabled me to become the kind of scholar that I wanted to become, but didn't really think was ever going to happen. By which I mean, over the course of those years, I was able to not only continue my studies in literature, but to thoroughly integrate them with my studies in Plato and Aquinas and the Western philosophical and theological tradition, and then to as a writer to write scholarly and non-scholarly essays that draw together philosophy, theology, and the arts in myriad different ways. While at Villanova, however, my reputation as a poet, which was something that I didn't anticipate ever having, began to grow. And as the years went on, I began to spend more and more of my time devoted to the writing of poems. And so that has culminated in a big leap of faith, which I took just 2 months ago, where I left Villanova and joined the faculty of the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where I'm going to be, as you said at the outset, the founding director of a new Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing, which I'm very excited to share with you today.
Well, Mario, what next should we ask our guest?
I have a question that has been haunting me for a while, and it's related to what you are doing, but I'm not sure how close. And is this: in the United States, and also you can find everywhere in Latin America, there is an increase of studies in technology, science, business, everywhere, where humanity is completely forgotten or put aside because they are not practical, they are not really the way to progress and the development of sustainable democracy and things of that nature. So many programs has been closed in philosophy, and that is very common. And the argument that people are saying is that democracy doesn't really need humanities. we assume that philosophy is part of humanities. Now, if you were to defend your program as a way by which you also, through humanities, can build democracy, what would you say to those people?
On the side of the argument you were just stating is the age-old vision of America as a utilitarian country or utilitarian civilization of can-do people who are less concerned with theory and more concerned with practice. I remember my high school history my middle school history textbook saying just that. Great new discoveries in the abstract sciences were being made in France and in Germany. And of course, when my father was a young biochemist, he had to learn his French and his German because most of the scholarly publications were still being published in those languages. It's no longer the case now, of course. And whereas Americans were inventing things like, the cotton gin. And so history is on the side that democracy, at least the American democratic spirit, has a certain concern with prudence and a concern with utility to it. But I think I'm one of those, and I think just to refer to Maritain yet again, I think Maritain was one of those who think that that an American democratic civilization at its best is a fulfillment of the vision of the polis, or the political community first given to us by Aristotle. And we need to look no further than to the idea of self-government to see that a democracy that reduces itself to the march of progress, technological and economic or otherwise, will not long remain a democracy. That democracy is an experiment in self-government. And from Plato and Aristotle onward, self-government is understood in the most profound possible sense, that it's through the intellectual soul that we become masters of ourselves. And it's only through becoming masters of ourselves that we become worthy of citizenship. Hannah Arendt says, I think in The Human Condition, that the distinctive quality of citizenship for the Greeks was that it was the condition of neither ruling others nor being ruled by others, but rather by governing in community. And I just don't see how anyone could ever govern in community, anyone could self-govern if they don't understand, if they don't have a sense of how their soul is ordered to the knowledge of truth, and that through the contemplation of that truth, that they become fitted or worthy of governing themselves and participating as political animals in a broader community. I don't think that's such a hard sell. There are so many fine documents from the founding fathers of our country, including the great debates over the Constitution and the other incidental papers that they produced, not to mention the late writings of John Adams and even Thomas Jefferson, that indicate that they too saw themselves as trying to build up a republic worthy of the name and worthy of the classical vision of self-government that, first appeared with Aristotle and Plato, and then, of course, was refined in certain ways by the Roman tradition.
Christopher, does that sound right to you? Or do you want to go ahead? What next?
Well, the question I would have, the defense you give for philosophy, and I guess it would be the same defense you give for poetry, almost seems to be the same defense that George Washington and some of the followers gave for religion, namely that religion is important to a polity because it makes good men, makes self-restrained men. But that seems to make religion a means rather than an end. And almost what you're saying here suggests that the study of philosophy is a means rather than end. Whereas I think I'm right to say that in Aristotle, it's seen rather as the end, actually the end of the polity, ultimately. So, I guess that my question is, how do you perceive it that your analysis there is does do that, that it reduces the intellectual life, the philosophical life, to a means rather than an end.
No, I would push back against that. I think that in the shape of the question, it was to explain to a citizenry why it's impossible to be citizens if you're not first intellectuals. But I think that you mentioned briefly, there's a certain consonance between what I was saying about the importance of the intellectual life for democracy or for politics, and it might be for poetry as well. I think that that's true. And in fact, we would have to go back to where Jim started with his discussion of beauty. I'm going to refer one more time to Jacques Maritain, and maybe I'll let him rest for the day. I don't know. And then I'm.
Oh no, we don't allow for that.
But you said I like to cite Maritain, so why not? And then I'll probably have to turn to von Balthasar too for a moment, because I think von Balthasar, though not known for clarifying much of anything, does clarify something that's Maritain, or does specify something that Maritain announces more generally. One of the beauties of Maritain's personalism, and it's present, in everything from Freedom in the Modern World and integral humanism onto the person, the common good, is that the person is by nature ordered to the transcendentals, and by way of the transcendentals to the contemplation of God. And so there is a intrinsic primacy to contemplation in human nature. And the reason that there's a primacy to contemplation in human nature is because it's through contemplation that our human natures participate in the truth as such. And here comes von Balthasar. When we contemplate the truth as such, we're contemplating the splendor of form. That is to say, the self-diffusive and intrinsically, infinitely self-giving generosity of being as such. This is the truth that's fundamental to reality, because reality or creation come to be only through the self-giving generosity and beauty or glory of God in creating all things. And it's the last word about reality, because it's through the contemplation of this free self-giving glory of God that all created things come to their fulfillment and their reunion, their recommunion with God. So this procession and return, procession forth in beauty or glory from God, and return to glory and the beauty of God, is what orders all of reality as such. And so everything, whether it's the nature of the human person, the nature of the political community, or the nature of those various arts and activities in which we engage, including poetry, must find its fundamental ground, its foundation in that pattern. And so I do think, I like Christopher's question, because I'm only too familiar with the kinds of moral utilitarianism that justify the presence of religion as a source of moral backbone and moral agency, all of which have something to be said about themselves, even as they disfigure the truth. The truth they disfigure is precisely that when we begin speaking in those utilitarian terms, we risk occluding the fundamental generosity of being that for human beings is participated in through contemplation. And so, yes, I think any appearance or any attempt to occlude that is disfiguring of our understanding of politics or of any other human institution. Contemplation has to transcend practice, and being and the truth itself has to transcend any moral or utilitarian good.
I wholeheartedly agree, but will it play in Houston? How are you going to bring that vision to Houston? and who will join you there in Houston, and what sorts of students will you have there in Houston? Or will it be the case that most of the students aren't in Houston? Not even the teachers are in Houston. Tell us all about this modern development, hyper-modern development.
All of these questions are important questions that need to be answered. So first of all, when I was asked to become the founding director of a new Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing, I was taken aback because nobody seems to be doing anything new in our day. As Mario was suggesting, people love to deconstruct things or to demolish them so as to clear room for a new freeway, but they're not interested in building up anything. And of course, we Catholics, even in the church, have fallen prey to this. It's so dismaying to see even some of our most devout fellow Catholics spend their time, rather than say picking up De Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life, spending their times creating a simulacrum for themselves of the intellectual and the spiritual life as they digest and argue about various church politics. My friend, the theologian Larry Chapp, loves to attack all of these YouTube celebrity, so-called traditionalist Catholics in his Communio blog, and I think he's right to be so critical of them. But what I find so frightening is the way. We've got an accident somewhere in East Lansing, Michigan. What I find so dismaying is that, I'm an Augustinian, I guess is how I would want to put this. First of all, curiositas and studiositas are distinct, but they're dangerously similar in sensation. And too often I see even well-meaning, devout Catholics in our day falling prey to the sin of curiositas when they substitute, again, squabbling or internecine debates over various church disciplines and doctrines when they use that as a substitute for the bona fide intellectual life to which we're all called, which is one achieved primarily not through argument, but through prayer and contemplation. So how surprised I was when the University of St. Thomas in Houston, which is well known as a great Catholic university, and especially well known for its Center for Thomistic Studies, asked me to start a Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing in the Catholic intellectual and literary tradition. Again, I just couldn't help but think, nobody's doing anything new these days. Nobody's building anything. And they're asking me to build it. And not only are they asking me to build it, they're asking me to build it precisely because they want to become ever more known as an authentically faithful Catholic university. So I'm hopeful that actually this new Master of Fine Arts program will be a great thing in itself, but it will also be the cornerstone of a larger program to bring the Catholic intellectual and literary life to American Catholics across the country, beginning first primarily in Houston in some ways, but we have an itinerary to build the program in such a way that within 10 years, everyone from grade school and high school students up to the octogenarians among us will be
Mario. That's Mario.
I was thinking of my father, but we'll be beneficiaries in some way or another of the things that we're doing. But you're one of those many questions you asked, Jim, was about who should come to this program. So let me just say a brief thing about the program. All Master of Fine Arts programs have at their center a commitment to craft. And they're fine arts degrees before they are liberal arts degrees. And therefore, what's central to a fine arts degree, a Master of Fine Arts degree included, is the making of a good work. And so our program in some ways will be akin to all Master of Fine Arts programs worthy of the name. We're going to gather students who we think already have some talent in writing, and we're just going to try to apprentice them, to workshop them, to get them into the workshop, to improve upon their work through first of all, putting pressure on them to keep writing, and second of all, to subject them to the critique of one another in lively workshop seminar discussions. In some respects, will be very similar to other. So in some respects, this workshop aspect of our program will be similar to most Master of Fine Arts programs. There will, however, be, to my mind, a crucial difference even at that level. First of all, Joshua Wren, my fellow founding faculty member and the publisher of Wise Blood Books, which was a book inspired by John Paul II, or was a publishing company inspired by John Paul II's letter to artists, and has as its mission to discover new epiphanies of beauty. Joshua has a deeply informed sense of the craft of fiction as being shaped by metaphysics. And so from Aristotle's Poetics forward, his students will be thinking of narrative and the art of the novel in light of the fundamental terrain of being. For on my side of things, as the lead poet on the faculty, I sort of stand apart from the majority of contemporary poets insofar as I've spent my entire career writing poetry in meter and rhyme. And so the craft of poetry as an ancient art, but also as a metrical art, is going to have pride of place and will be a centerpiece of my instruction to the poets who come to the program. But on top of that, there's more. This is a program that is open to everyone, and we want anyone with a talent for the craft of fiction or poetry or memoir or essays, as we'll be building up in the years ahead, to come and apply to our program. But a centerpiece of our curriculum will be an integrated series of seminars in the Western literary tradition, specifically as shaped by the Catholic tradition. And so we'll have one course that places at its center Virgil, Augustine's Confessions, Dante, and then Manzoni, the great Italian 19th century novelist. And then we will also have courses in the European Catholic Revival and in the Catholic imagination in modern American literature, where we'll have, I don't know about Dorothy Day yet, that's still up for debate, but we will certainly have Merton and J.F. Powers and Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy, and up until to our contemporaries, including Dana Gioia and Helen Pinkerton, playing taking a central place in our curriculum. What we're hoping, and one more thing, and then there will be a strong seminar in the philosophy of art and beauty coming out of the Catholic tradition, where we'll begin with Plato and Aristotle and go through the Pseudo-Dionysius and on through Jacques Mariton's Art and Scholasticism and Gilson's works in the fine arts, and culminating, I think we'll do this, I'm 99% sure, culminating in Ratzinger's The Spirit of the Liturgy. What we want is to provide an intellectual home for all those people who love literature, who know that art can change your life. And the reason that art can change your life is because art has to do with beauty, and beauty has something to do with the mystery of grace. And so we are especially seeking both to provide a coherent curriculum for people who recognize these truths already, and to try to do something a little distinctive from other Master of Fine Arts programs by giving all of our students a coherent and well-integrated introduction to the Catholic literary and intellectual tradition. But one more note. As I said, anybody who cares about craft should come to our program. Anyone who says or knows that art can change your life should come to our program, regardless of whether they're Catholic or not. Because when we think of the Catholic literary tradition from O'Connor and Percy and Merton and Mariton and others, the first thing we think about is that the first insight that the Catholic Church has to share with us, and that the broader philosophical and theological tradition of Catholicism has to share with us, is that human beings are ensouled and our souls are intellectual. And the reason that an encounter with beauty can change our life is because we are spiritual beings who are capable of transcending our materiality through the encounter with the transcendentals, with truth, goodness, and beauty. Anybody who doesn't believe that that's true should not come to our program. Anybody who doesn't believe that our souls are transformed by an encounter with truth, goodness, and beauty should actually just sit down and rethink their life. But for everybody else, they will find a welcome entree into our classroom. You had so many questions, Jim. I still have to answer one more. Nobody will be in Houston. We are primarily going to be an online Master of Fine Arts program. Most people who are ready for a graduate program in writing are people who are otherwise engaged in a profession. Among our early applicants to the program are people who have academic positions, but they want to have time to focus on their writing. So they may have a PhD already and they're teaching at the college level, but they want to develop their writing. Or people who are just, this is the way with writers. Most writers are always doing something else first. And most writers, thanks to God's blessing, often have families. And we just thought it would be imprudent to create another residential MFA program when in fact there are many talented writers, many of whom we were already aware before the program was even dreamed of, who would benefit from doing a program but can't move across the country to do it. And so our program is going to be primarily online with a short 10-day residency every January down in Houston, because January is the most pleasant month in Houston.
Mario, we know that you draw us back again and again to the central role of an encounter with the person of Jesus Christ. Do you see that as something that's built into the program that James is presenting? Do you see it in relation to that program? Or would you like to pursue some other angle of what James has proposed?
Good question. What I found in your words is an echo of Father Giussani when he said that we shouldn't react, we need to propose. And the proposal comes from an encounter with the person of Christ, and Christ is beautiful. From that on, everything flows. That's what in my heart, I felt when you were explaining your program, which ultimately is not a program. I think it's a life. Mm. And I think that's what I can say. But the question I also have is perhaps it's more sociological if you want to call it utilitarian. What is the feeling of people young people who may be interested in this program about poetry?
What's the feeling?
My point is that when I talk to freshmen or people even older, they perhaps are more inclined among Catholics, they are more inclined to confront the culture of death, the struggle, cultural wars, and everything in between. And they are in these catacombs and they produce those YouTubes. And so they skill how to debate these heretic souls. But I never thought carefully about those who may be precisely on the side of what about the beauty? What about poetry? What is the percentage of people you feel may be interested in that side?
So that's a very good question. You're part of what you're describing is an observation I have myself made. In fact, I think Jim holding up Vision of the Soul earlier, that book is really the outcome of it. that book was originally inspired by the shared experience of so many of us in the first decade of the 21st century, where America's conservative party started a war in Iraq, and one began to wonder what exactly was it that so-called conservatives wanted to conserve. I've always found the term conservative a beautiful name, and I continue to do so. And the reason I like the term conservative is because there are precious things worth preserving, and the transcendentals are our quick little easy term to refer to those things. That our whole inheritance of all that is true, all that is good, and all that is beautiful. I think there was a time when young people were especially attracted to the political drama of human life and could be exercised by that. And I think in our day, there still are such people, and they're increasingly drawn into what I see as a very materialistic and totalitarian form of left-wing activism, again, in our time. But most young people react the same way I do with a lot of the political visions that are present today, and they see it as impoverished and destructive and incapable of building anything worth loving. And so it's generally been my experience that that young people who have any sort of inkling towards the intellectual life are first of all drawn to beauty, and not just beauty in a sentimental or emotional sense, but beauty as that principle that shows the grace or the gratuity of being. And so it's consistently been the case when I go to, say, smaller Catholic schools like Christendom, or to smaller Christian schools like Hillsdale or Eastern University back in Pennsylvania. What those students are most illuminated by and excited for are whatever they found in their first encounter with Plato's Symposium or with Augustine's Confessions. I think their way, this is kind of going back to Christopher's question earlier, I think they're sorry, Mario, your first question, actually. I think they're aware of how willfully disenchanted so much of contemporary civilization is. And when they discover that there's the possibility of grace, including the grace of the intellectual life, they really seem to truly awaken to it and be converted by it. So within that group of young people, which is a substantial group of young people, there's a tremendous love of poetry. But I shouldn't be overly hopeful. That's the last thing I'd want to be. The poetry in our day is a minority art, and it probably will remain a minority art, even if it assumes, as it seems to be doing, if it assumes a more prominent place than it had 10, 15, or even 20 years ago. That's in part a consequence of the way in which, or the centrality of storytelling to human life. Films and novels are a great way to tell stories. Poems also are wonderful ways to tell stories, but there are some things that poetic narratives can do that novels and films cannot do, to be sure. But there are also things, and as far as storytelling goes, more fundamental things that are more easily done in the novel and film. Because storytelling is so fundamental to the arts and to human life, wherever stories are most easily and told and most widely disseminated will always, I think, be the dominant art form. So poetry is going to be always, I think, moving forward, secondary in that regard. But I also think that poetry can recover some of its capacity for storytelling. In fact, it needs to. And that also it has so many other virtues, including the way in which it seems to go deeper into reality, deeper into being than most narratives do, than especially the novel does. That I think poetry will always have a central role, even if it's been displaced from its traditional function as telling the tale of the tribe, as Mallarmé once put it.
Christopher, questions, new ones, deeper ones, trickier ones?
I'd like to ask a bit about his poetry. I had the pleasure of reading a few of your poems last night when I saw your name. One can find his poems online, so if anybody wants to go peruse them, they can find them there. I noticed one thing I struck me about them immediately was that they don't share in the obscurity of, say, the 20th century poetry since the 20th century, and they're also written in meter and rhyme. Do you have any kind of like a artistic rationale for why you write the way you write, or is it simply just the way you write?
Yes. All these things tend to start with what you're doing, and then you reflect on what you're doing, and you discover that there are reasons for what you're doing, right? And hopefully those reasons are reasons, not rationales. And that's, on balance, that's how it was with me. I figured out pretty early that I wanted to be a writer. I studied at the University of Michigan precisely because Michigan had this well-developed Hopwood program in creative writing. But I came to Michigan intending to be a novelist and a short story writer, and in fact had some success at that. But one day, fairly soon after leaving Ann Arbor, I was working in Boston, in fact, I realized that all I was reading for pleasure was poetry. I was still reading novels, but I was reading them the way a technician reads them. I was reading them to see what the authors were doing and what I could steal and what I needed to learn from them if I was going to improve my writing. So there was an absence of joy and of freedom or liberality to the way I was reading fiction. Whereas with poetry, I was just turning with delight to discover. In those days, I was reading mostly the great modernists, Yeats, Ezra Pound, and Eliot. I was just turning with wonder to figure out what strange thing they were going to do next. And one day I realized, if literature is going to continue to play the role that it has in my life, it's not as a potential profession or merely a trade, but as something that really is integral to living in the world the way I want to live in the world. I was probably going to have to leave fiction writing behind. And so I just one day dropped, as it were, the fiction pen and decided that I would write poems. And part of the rationale for that was that I figured nobody could ever make a living as a poet. And so I would always be writing poetry for the right reason, which was for the good of the poem, rather than for some sense of personal advancement or glory or something, since there's no glory to be gained in these things. But what was it that had attracted me to poetry? The answer was not hard to find. The one thing that poetry had that prose fiction didn't have was verse, was meter. From the first introduction to poetry that I ever had, I was fascinated by the way in which iambs clicked together to form a line of verse. And I remember actually a professor at the University of Michigan introducing us to iambic pentameter, the meter of Shakespeare and all of the major poems written in the English tradition. And I don't remember what else happened in class that day, because I spent the rest of the hour trying to write a single line of iambic pentameter. A sonnet every day for 5 long years is the line I wrote. I took that line home and I showed it to my friends, back to the dorm, I should say. I showed it to my friends at dinner. I said, look, this is iambic pentameter. And I remember them all staring around at this notebook and saying, what does that mean? And I tried to explain it to them. And then I took that sheet of paper up to my room that night and I wrote 13 more lines. And by the end of the night, I had written a sonnet. It took about 5 hours to do. And I came home from classes the next day and ate dinner and went up to my room and wrote a second sonnet and a third one and a fourth one, and then finally a fifth one. And at the end of the week, I'd written these 5 sonnets. And what was so enrapturing about that experience was the way in which poetry is verse. That is to say, it's ordered and measured speech down to the very syllables, and down indeed to to put it a little bit loosely, the relative weight of the syllables that create these stresses. That's really been my fascination ever since. And it took me a long time to kind of explain it to myself, but I didn't have to explain it to myself in the end, because I discovered so many resources in the tradition, from St. Augustine's De Musica to Plato's discussion of poetry making, which is very brief in the Symposium, that what I was finding attractive there is that when you write a line of verse, you're ordering at a microcosmic level these words. And in that microcosmic ordering, you're echoing and refracting and reflecting the broader order of the cosmos, of the macrocosm. And it's for this reason, this very formal reason, because it's precisely because verse is connected at the level of form to the order of things, that poetry has a capacity for the profound, that it's capable of going deep into being in a way I think that prose fiction cannot do. But that sounds like a fairly elaborate answer, but I think it's an answer that explains something that we all encounter when we encounter poetry. And that is when we hear the ordering of speech, when we hear the metrical rhythm of things, we don't need to have been trained in the art of prosody to already feel it working upon us, which is why even very simple poems can have profound effects upon those who hear them.
Yes, so interesting. Would you agree that with Plato and the Ion, that the poet is possessed by the god?
I'll go farther than just agreeing with it. I've even written a book on the subject called The Fortunes of Poetry in an Age of Unmaking. So I mentioned the Symposium earlier. Diotima says to Socrates, when she's trying to explain the analogical use of language, she says, listen, all kinds of making are poiesis, but there's only one kind of making that we allow the name poiesis, and that's what we call poetry. As she puts it, the part the muses give us with melody and rhythm, in my preferred translation of those lines. And we wonder, why does she choose poiesis as the prototypical example of the analogical use of language? Poetry is poiesis, but then there are other kinds of making that we don't normally call poiesis, except when they become such a good kind of making that we say, that's poetry. By which I mean, if a wide receiver goes out and makes a fantastic catch 50 yards down the field and then runs it down the sideline into the end zone, we say, that's poetry in motion. That's to say, he made something, and it's a kind of making that has risen up to the level of poetry. Well, I think all of us have this kind of sense of poetry as the paradigmatic or the prototypical form of making. And the reason I think we have it there is for reasons that Plato explains to us in the Ion, but a little bit more extensively in the Phaedrus, that poetry requires technique and craft. It is a discipline and a kind of making like any other: carpentry, brick masonry, and so on and so forth. And yet it's a technique that we sense. It's an activity that involves technique, but where we sense that technique alone won't suffice. Some aspect of gift or inspiration or divine madness has to come upon the work to make it an integral whole that truly is truly good and truly transformative. And so I think the reason that poetry is the paradigmatic kind of making is because it's one of those activities of making where we see most clearly that it's partly from us, but it's also partly from someplace else, partly from someone else. It has to be partly inspired. So yes, I would completely agree with that.
James, could you read us one or two of your poems from the Strangeness of the Good?
Sure. Since I started out talking about the dangers of the obsessions of politics and the need to recover a contemplative dimension that's so fundamental to human life, I think I'll read the poem Revolutions, which is on, I went page 13 for those who have the book. I've been reflecting on this poem lately, especially its last stanza, which I was never so sure about. But in the last few months, as I've realized what the solution to our various political extremisms are, I felt like this stanza is totally vindicated. So here's a poem, Revolutions. The world's so cruel now, they say, demanding revolution, that someone be strung up or shot is the preferred solution. The broken backs of myriads have paved roads for the great, so topple statues of the dead to swat the hand of fate. The books shelved in the library lead us ourselves to spurn, so leave them in the rain to rot and all their words unlearn. When paradise does not arrive despite bone piled on bone, the revolution turns at last, but to devour its own. It comes as well for those who plead for thought and beauty's case, their high-walled pleasure garden flattened by blunt boot and smug face. But nonetheless, those who would make or savor some good thing must carry on as if at leisure, although the dark hordes ring.
Thank you.
That the need to realize that even the political dimensions of our lives are transcended by our entrance into that mystery of being to which I keep referring, was one of the central themes of this book, The Strangeness of the Good. And in fact, the poem, a line from which the book takes its title, a poem of mine called Through the Water, I think is the place where the book is the poem around which the book really took shape, because it's itself a poem about baptism. And I'm always reminded of, I think it's Ratzinger in, I think it's in his Jesus of Nazareth, where he has a nice reflection on the nature of baptism and the submersion in water as a death and rebirth. Of course, it's to be found everywhere in the tradition, but I think he has an especially powerful reflection on it. And I was always reminded of one of my favorite poets, Ivor Winters, the great Stanford poet and critic. One of his early sonnets is one called The Castle of Thorns, which is a kind of obscure poem because it relies a lot on medieval folklore to make sense. It's an allegorical poem, and so you need to have a sort of sense of where the key is to the allegory. And so he included a note to that poem in his collected poems that just includes the following little phrase from Ivor Winters. He, as in man, must in some way cross or dive under the water, which is the most ancient symbol of the barrier between two worlds. So I had been asked by actually a Detroit diocesan magazine called Unleash the Gospel to write a poem for their magazine on baptism. And I missed the deadline, but one night actually I was showering, the water was pouring down over my face, and I thought, yes, now I know what it means to be baptized, to go through the water, and the way in which baptisms of various kinds play such a central role in our life, in awakening us to the mystery that's more profound in us than we had any idea until that moment. not a great sentence there, but maybe the poem will make up for it. Here's a poem called Through the Water. Far back within the mansion of our thought, we glimpse a lintel with a door that's shut, and through which all our lives would seem to lead, though we feel powerless to say toward what. It is the place where all the shapes we know give way to whispers in a gnawing gut. And so, in childhood, we will duck beneath the waterfall into a hidden cove. In summer, pass within a stand of pines, cut off from those bright fields in which we rove, whose needles lay a softening bed of silence, and great boughs tightly weave a sacred grove. When winter settles in and our skies darken, we take a trampled path by pond and wood, and find beneath an arch of slumbering thorns stray tufts of fur, a skull stripped of its hood. Then turn and look down through the thickening ice in wonder at the strangeness of the good. And Peter, falling through that plain where he had only cast his nets before, and where Behemoth stalked in darkest depths that sank and sank as if there were no floor, he cried out to the wind and felt a hand that clutched and bore his burden back to shore. We know that we must fall into such waters, must lose ourselves within their breathless power, until we are raised up, hair drenched, eyes stinging, by one who says to us that from this hour we have passed through, we're dead but have returned, and are a new creation come to flower.
Thank you so very much. Your first poem had to do with the rage of revolution. And there is, we know, an alternative to the rage of revolution, and that's the devotion to the common good and the person, as the person develops within the common good. And Maritain spoke of the separated common good, which leads us to the transcendent God, who is the source of all goodness. Now, you're trying to put all sorts of beautiful things into a program, Master of Fine Arts. And there is, as you know, and this program regularly reminds its viewers, there is a political effort to do that in the American Solidarity Party. That's our commitment. And with that, we turn to today's gospel from Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but underneath are ravenous wolves. By their fruits you will know them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Just so every good tree bears good fruit, and a rotten tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a rotten tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. So by their fruits you will know them. Come, Lord Jesus, come." Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to be with you.
Good luck.
Godspeed. Godspeed.
The mission of Holy Apostles College and Seminary is to form faithful witnesses of Christ. Year after year, the prestigious Newman Guide has recommended Holy Apostles for our academic excellence and steadfast fidelity to the magisterial teachings of the Catholic Church. We are also fully accredited and the leader in Catholic online learning. Our students enjoy the unsurpassed flexibility to study on their own time and anywhere in the world through asynchronous engagement. Holy Apostles is dedicated to the relentless pursuit of truth, which allows students in all academic programs, including undergraduate, graduate, and personal interest, to formulate a coherent worldview based on both faith and reason. The study of the liberal arts also develops and refines key competencies associated with career readiness, such as critical thinking and problem solving, clear communication, collaboration, and a strong work ethic. The tuition rate at Holy Apostles is one of the most affordable in the country. Yearly tuition for a full-time undergraduate is under $12,000. Students at Holy Apostles can graduate with minimal or even no college debt, which enables them to live out their calling as faithful witnesses of Christ without heavy financial burdens holding them back. Please visit www.holyapostles.edu/admissions for more information. The Fall 2021 admissions deadline is Friday, July 23rd. Classes start Monday, August 30th. See you soon.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.